Today I want to talk to you about Naverre, which was one of the things that was requested for me to talk about. But before I go into that, I want to talk about something that I have not really discussed all that much, and that's the fact that I have a wiki. Now, this wiki is primarily for the Imperium. At the moment, that's taking the focus of Primus. Now, as of me recording this, I simply have not had the spare time necessary to really delve into actually writing all that much for it, because it's just me doing it, obviously. I've tried to add some racial backgrounds and stuff like that. I am hopeful that by the time you're watching this, which will be a bit from now, there will be more stuff written there. I intend to actually really flesh it out and add a whole bunch of lore and backstory for the setting and update it as the story progresses. But obviously that's a lot of work, and, well, it's actually not that much work, but it's a lot of time, and I don't have a lot of time right now. So in case you're wondering, that's what's up with that. Regardless of that, let's go ahead and talk about the Naverre. Now, the Naverre Confederacy consists of the states of Zaikal, Al-Jalima, Al-Arkas, Tufa, and Iraq in the sort of western middle chunk of the primary continent. Its left border consists of the Inner Sea. Its right border is marred by mountain ranges, which divide it from the kingdoms of Alluvia and Sho, or the nations of Alluvia and Sho, excuse me, only one of those is a kingdom, and the Republic of the Osteth. Now, the Naverre is where most of the trolls, orcs, banderlings, and ogres live. Obviously, as with all places, this is just referring to a generalized majority. There are, of course, other races present within all the areas, but this is where the vast majority of them live. Now, because you guys know certain things about the story, at this point I can go ahead and tell you that one of the reasons so many of the races are centralized to a given area, as a general, of course, not counting exceptions, is because that's what the Scions did to them. They said, well, you're useful for this. And they got all the members of a given race and just put them all in one area and said, okay, you're going to work on this now. There's some lore about the individual races, not much of significance, but one thing that really does matter, because the Confederacy was founded prior to the Kingdom of Alluvia, but after the Republic and after the Empire of the Show. What happened? See, trolls have a very high pain tolerance. But kind of as a consequence, they have a very high sense tolerance. I don't know how to put this. Basically, to a normal person, you probably enjoy something soft, like something furry, like a kitten, or like a silk carpet or whatever. To a troll, that's magnified. See, due to the nature of their physiology and their slight regenerative properties, and due to the nature of their culture and their upbringing, trolls tend to really like things that feel, taste, smell, and look much nicer than other beasts. So basically, their standard of luxury is way up here, whereas for most other races, it's much further down here. Make sense? So the trolls, as a natural byproduct of this, basically just kind of became traders. At first, they were leaning more towards roving bands of stealing, but it took very little time for them to realize that that was not only not going to work long term, but to realize there was a better path to maintaining that, and that was to become the ones who facilitate trade and become traders themselves. Traders, to make that clear, not traitors. Regardless, so these traders basically founded the Gold Road, which is a large, it's not actually made of gold, but it's this massive, well-maintained highway with lots of troops and lights on it that goes down through the middle of the actual Naverre Desert, which is actually only a small portion of the Naverre. I know I've given this false impression, so to make this clear, the whole of the Naverre is not desert. Okay, there is a fairly large desert there, but for some reason a lot of my players and viewers have associated the whole of the Naverre with the desert, probably because most of their adventures have occurred in that desert. But like if you're looking at the whole of the Confederacy here, this chunk up here is desert, and then down here is normal plains and farmland and other standard variety of terrain. So the Gold Road bisects all of that, goes all the way up and all the way down, very well maintained. The trolls themselves got it together, and it was a great way to reach out to huge chunks of it, including, actually I wrote these down, so why don't I just look them up really quick. The Reach, the Band, and the Cusp. Now, this was before the Edge was settled. These are names for regions, not political boundaries. The Reach is the northernmost mountain range that happens to be where Fox Ridge is, for example. The band is over here. It refers to a massive, like there's this mountain range, and then there's this mountain range, and then there's a large valley in between the two. That's the band. The cusp is the southern edge, which is basically a large series of foothills that lead up into the Osteth mountain range, and that's basically their natural border between the Republic and the Confederacy. The edge would eventually be founded, which is way up north on the edges of the Great Glendenwood Forest and closer to Collier. That's when Mr. Zykal would go up there. Zyke of Seaspear, who would found the state of Zykal. And that's when the edge would come into being. But regardless, so that's the four regions now. At the time, though, when it was founded, it was just the three regions, and the Gold Road allowed transit between all of them. The Trolls facilitated this trade and became richer and richer, and they basically started expanding a mercantile empire, a very British colonial kind of a power, in efforts of constantly getting more and more goods to satisfy their desire for luxury. Now, this is a good time to pause and say that most of the other races don't have a big stake. Like the orcs and the elves, both in this setting, are basically what most settings would define as humans. There's not a lot that varies them from your average individual as far as physiology and whatnot. They're different culturally, and they have their different upbringings. The elves, for example, believe strongly in monetary function and think bribery is an everyday occurrence. The orcs tend to think very familially, believing that it's very, that ties of family and blood are more important than other things. But that's mostly a cultural variance. Other than that, though, they're kind of the average middle of the road, so I don't have much to share about them. The ogres, the trolls, the banderlings, they're slightly different. So, banderlings are by far the most populous race amongst the Naverre, by a huge margin, actually. They are probably, like, if you were to divvy up all the percentage of all the denizens of the Naverre, I'd say they're probably about 60% of everyone. It's a pretty big number. Orcs would probably be second, and then trolls, and then ogres. But the thing is, banderlings don't really draw attention to themselves all that much, so they tend to just kind of be there. They, in many ways, serve a similar function to the Moorsmen over in the Show Empire, which we'll be talking about either last week or next week. I'm actually not sure where this happens in result. Where's my calendar? Well, it doesn't matter. At some point, other point in this month, we'll be talking about the Show Empire as well. The banderlings, however, they have no ambition for the most part. Some of them do, but most of the banderlings seem to simply be accepting of being part of their units. Now, I don't mean familial units. I mean, it's kind of tribal. Basically, a given banderling will tend to be more positively inclined towards another given banderling. They're actually some of the most racially biased of all the races in Primus, and so banderlings tend to stick with other banderlings, which leads towards, due to the nature of the way the Navarre Confederacy works, banderlings tend to consist of so many aspects of the actual running of that society. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Point being, there's lots of banderlings. There's a decent number of trolls. The trolls wanted more and more and more and more. They basically started taking, and we came very close to actual warfare. This was before the Dericost Accords, for a bit of timeline perspective. This was before the Alluvian Kingdom even existed. And so this is actually referred to in the history books as the non-war, because no actual conflict of any significant scale actually happened. No big battles or anything like that. But it was close. Things were getting pretty heated. Now, you might ask, well, what pulled them from the brink? The ogres did. See, ogres culturally have developed this thing. You look at an ogre, what do you think? Big, dumb, right? Those are like probably the first two adjectives that jump to mind. Big, dumb, brute, if you want to add a noun at the end of that. Although I guess brute could be, well, brutish would be more of an adjective. But the point being, that's what you think. And tends to be true in setting, too. The vast majority of normal people don't realize ogres actually tend to be quite intelligent in lore. They're actually very smart and very capable. They have cultivated this whole weird, dumb thing as a whole species, as a cultural bias, because A, they find that it appeals to them and their sense of their own quiet superiority, thinking that other people have no idea, what they're actually dealing with when they deal with this, and B, because it's very advantageous. Most of the actual major motions on a large political scale within the Navarre Confederacy, even before it was founded, so just in the Navarre Desert area and in the whole Western Reaches area, was done because of ogres. They're the ones who precipitated most of the function of this. So the Banderlings and orcs were on one side, and the trolls were on the other. And the trolls had a lot of the wealth and a lot of the political power, and they're the ones who were going to be capable of actually pushing back against the others. They wanted to form a colonial superpower. They wanted to just conquer and say, this is ours now, and we're going to take what we want from it. Now, the ogres stepped in. Now, here's the thing about ogres. Partially as a result of that whole big dumb brute thing, they tend to be bodyguards everywhere. Sometimes they tend to be advisors, only to people who actually know the true nature of how smart ogres can actually be, which again is very few. The ogres, as a group, as a unit, worked together, coordinated with each other. The ogres who were working alongside of the trolls and the ogres who were working alongside the banderlings, the orcs, all got together and said, we need to stop this, because they, being the intelligent and wise creatures they are, understood how bad a war would be in a setting like this. So they decided to put forth a few compromises and a few positions, and basically put forth the idea of what would become the Naverre Confederacy. And they did it in a way so that both sides felt like it was their idea. With this, the Confederacy was founded. Now, this is a true confederacy in the more traditional sense of the word. For those who don't know what that means while there is a federal government, it effectively only exists to be a unit for interacting with other nations. Otherwise, each state of the Confederacy handles its own affairs and does its own thing. Make sense? Now, there are distributors throughout the Naverre who handle each region, as the regions I mentioned before, the Reach, the Cusp, and the Band. Sorry, it's been a long day. And later on, the Edge. Each of these has one individual, usually a troll, who is a distributor, and their purpose is to basically keep things coordinated, because those kind of bypass political boundaries, but they are usually regionally unified. So in other words, the logic here was being everyone within, the Reach, for example, which primarily is where the desert actually is, would have to deal with mundane matters and political matters and cultural matters relating to living in a freaking desert. So regardless of the fact that that covers 3 separate states, territories, there's one person handling the whole region as far as coordinating. Make sense? He doesn't actually in charge of the region. He is not the boss of the governor of that state. He is simply someone who helps to coordinate and work with the other distributors and work within that specific area, kind of as a separate body, if you will. And of course, each distributor does report to the actual ministry, which is where the federal side of the government comes in. That is, of course, based in Iraq, the massive, expansive port city that sits on the inner sea on the western coast. Yes, western coast, I had that right. Now, so that's the high end. You've got the ministry up here with the prime minister. Now, the prime minister is not the leader of the Confederacy. Let's make that absolutely clear. The prime minister, his actual role would best be described as ambassador. They are the face of the Confederacy, so it is their job to go out and actually be the person who meets with the High Queen, who meets with the Senate of the Republic, who meets with the Emperor of the show. That's their job. In most recent times, that has been Lunacha of Seeker, a Banderling woman who is an extremely skilled and adept politician who was recently recruited into Guido's growing mercantile empire. Go figure. So that's their job. And then there's the ministry, of course. The ministry is more of a bureaucracy than it is a leadership. It's the federal side of things, so it's supposed to coordinate things across the whole of the area. Currency and the regulation thereof is part of that. They, of course, adopted the show method. Of course they did. And they're responsible for maintaining large-scale things. There are a few federal laws, but very few. The one truly important thing the ministry does is they run the military. Now, each state does have its own militia forces, but there is a Naverre military, which does not answer to a given state. It answers to the federal government. It answers to the ministry. And so that military is one cohesive body. And this was decided and ratified because the idea was they want one cohesive military power that can respond to any threats without regard to bias or red tape or anything like that. It's basically, there's a crisis here, go. It was trying to reduce the amount of red tape involved. Now, below that we have the governors of each states. I already mentioned the states. Zyke Zyke of Seaspear actually went and founded a new state after the formation of the Confederacy, the state of Zykal. But so as of the modern time, there's the state of Zykal, the state of Al Jalima, the state of Tufa, the state of Al Arkas, and the state of Yerak. Now, Yerak being the capital. The party, the live campaign has had so much interaction in Naverre that some of this is probably going to seem redundant. I apologize for that, because they've already done so much stuff in the Naverre. Several of the party members, the players, have actually come to me and said, if they had to pick one of these nations to live in, they'd choose the Naverre. But I'm getting to that. We haven't really discussed how they do their governmental styles things and whatnot. So there's a couple of things. So the governor is in charge of each given state. Now, below the governor is the mayors, each city having a mayor, and then there's a whole lot of bureaucracy in between both the governor and the mayors and the common people. Make sense? But there's not a huge line of sequential. It's basically governors are effectively the rulers of the Naverre, and then below them are the mayors of each city, and that's it. This is part of the compromise that was put into play. One of the other things they do, they have this magical woven system. Nobody's 100% sure where they got the idea for this or how they managed this, but the way this works is every single person within the Naverre has a vote. It is a true democracy in the sense that, if you have 1,000 people, 1,000 people vote, and whoever wins, wins. Make sense? Now, I mention that because there are exceptionally few true democracies in real life. There are votes, there are governments that involve voting, but usually that's voting for a representative or voting for someone who is going to vote, that kind of a thing. This is every single person directly votes. Now, here's the catch. Any given one of these leaders, most notably here's the positions that are voted in for. The mayor is voted in, of any given city, by the denizens of that city and surrounding area. And surrounding area is basically part of the city as well. I really shouldn't even have to mention that. But, local farmland, that's still technically a part of the city. The mayor has to be voted in. The governor has to be voted in by everyone within that particular area. The distributors are voted in by everyone within their region. And the prime minister is voted in by the ministry. Now, this is I'm probably thinking, well, wait, who gets the ministry in charge? Obviously, there's no voting with regards to the military. So let's take a step back. So the mayors are voted in by their city. Each one of these positions, hang on, before I go forward, each one of these positions is effectively a totalitarian dictatorship. The mayor has total power to do whatever he or she chooses of their city, of their little area. Governors have total power to do whatever they choose of their states. And, well, the prime minister doesn't have a lot of power, but the distributors have, you get the point. They are effectively dictators. Now, here's the catch. Their dictatorship can be pulled away at any time. There's no terms of service here. You are voted into office. If at any point in time enough people say we want to vote to change this, then a new vote is taken. This has led to some people being a mayor or a governor or whatever for days or weeks, and sometimes months. It has also led to a situation where someone has been a mayor or a governor for most of their life, for decades, because no one ever saw the need to change their leadership. Make sense? Because of the nature of this system, it also leads to a weird balance of power situation. They are dictators. They can do whatever they choose, but they have to know that anything they do can and will turn public opinion against them. If they decide to start going against the public can and will vote them out. Now, some people have tried to abuse this situation, for example, trying to hire in or use money to coerce certain people to vote for them. The catch is, that's usually not worth the expenditure. There's usually not enough power worthy of being the mayor to basically, the amount of money you'd have to pay in order to buy off all the votes necessary to maintain a majority over an area is huge and is not worth the income you'd take in return. So some people have basically just tried buying off, for example, local thugs, having, we'll kill you if you do this. The problem with that is this whole voting thing is kind of very important culturally to the Naverre, because it's how the Naverre avoided a war. Remember, the non-war came as a result of that kind of conflict, of certain groups of people trying to maintain power over others, and that has never left the public consciousness. Every time they go out to vote, they are aware of the fact that they are preventing that kind of thing from happening. It's one of the reasons this war has been so damaging to the Naverre people. It's come from an external source, But it has still been just horrifying because they did all this to prevent this kind of thing from happening. So there have been cases, for example, where a mayor will hire a bunch of thugs, and those thugs will try to prevent people from voting. Sometimes the thugs have change of hearts. Sometimes the thugs are beat to death by the crowd. You know, a guy with an axe is great and all, but 30 guys versus one guy with an axe, that's a foregone conclusion. And trolls tend to be regenerative, and ogres are big and strong, so you kind of see how this works out. So the long and the short of it is, while several people have abused the system over the years and tried to misuse it, most of those have not succeeded particularly well. The more clever people will abuse the system by, for example, having very good public relations while doing underhanded deals on the side and things that other people aren't aware of that don't actually damage or hurt the people around them. It's a very fine line, but there have been several. In fact, the party's actually encountered one mayor of a city. I don't remember the name of the city right now. Like that, where he was very criminally connected with the undermarket, which still existed at this point in time, but was trying very hard to make sure that that didn't actually hurt anyone in his city, and very publicly being, you know, oh, I will help you and take care of you, to ensure that he stayed in office. Now, this does extend, of course, to the governorship level. So every member of a state has a right to vote on who is the governor. Before you ask, yes, attempts have been made to try and falsify some of these votes. It's been usually difficult to do because any falsification would be pretty obvious. This is a magical vote that's going in. And the only way for that vote to happen, basically the way it works is your geographical location of commonality leads to certain patterns existing in your soul. I know this is a weird explanation, but just bear with me. So in other words, if you try to go to another city and vote on a mayorship there, you can't. You actually have no vote. The machine will reject you because it doesn't recognize you as being within its jurisdiction. Same with states. So you have to actually have been a resident for a decent period of time to make this happen. And then you try, then you go ahead and vote that way. So if you try to alter it, it's very, very, very hard to actually alter these votes in a way that actually is significant. Now, this has happened. One of the ex-governors of Alarcos, not the current one, had altered a significant number of these machines over the course of several years. This was a large campaign, as he quietly had his own arc weavers go in and basically reweave the devices to change votes to him in order to put him in governorship. Now, the funny thing was, in my opinion, this man didn't have to do this. He was what you'd call a well-intentioned extremist. If he had just walked up and said, I intend to do this and this and this, and it involved a lot of, we'll call it the Alaska thing. For those of you who don't know what that means, basically pillaging the hell out of the natural resources of the region for the benefit of the people that would benefit from that. This includes the actual citizens there. I mean, if you move to Alaska, you are paid money as a result of living there. This is not a joke. At least it wasn't a joke. I don't know if that's still true or not. So it's kind of like that. He wanted to just pillage. There were gem mines and silk mines, all sorts of very, very, very rare stuff, including some magicite veins that people weren't tapping. He wanted to be ahead of that. He wanted to be the person leading that charge with his own private companies that would ensure he would get the bulk of the money from it, but that money would still be distributed to the people of Alarcos. So for some reason, he decided to spend years slowly weaving these devices rather than just trying to publicly change people's opinion on the matter. Maybe he wouldn't have won. I don't know. That's a lot more debatable. And I can't decide that without really thinking about it. That would probably involve dice at that point. Regardless, he cheated the system. He faked the votes. He got in charge. And the funny thing was he got away with it for some time, but people kept kind of talking about it. And it got to the point where he was ousted from office, but not because people didn't like him. Quite the contrary. People were actually overall in favor of him being governor. And a lot of people still, to this day, remember him fondly and his governorship because he really brought Alarcos to a degree of mercantile power. Alarcos is, to this day, the trade state. That's what they're known for in the whole continent. And it was because of him and his actions and his shoving money into trade routes, into caravans, into the companies, into the mining facilities, everything, to just rip resources out and consume them to better the wealth of the area. Several of the most wealthiest cities in the world exist in the Alarcos state. So people liked him there, and people liked him being in charge, but they found out. He was caught. They found out that the votes were rigged, and they basically decided that's just unacceptable on the face of it. So they pushed him out of office. The person that took over ironically, was someone who was like, well, I think we should keep going with these policies, and ended up being a very popular governor because he kept the policies going. Go figure. I'm not saying crime doesn't pay. I'm just saying there have been very few recorded instances of people successfully gaming this system. Now, the distributors, they're voted in by the governors. The governors themselves vote in the distributors. I don't remember what I said earlier. Actually, to be completely honest, I'm really, really tired. I'm trying to remember a lot of lore off the top of my head. But that's how that works. The distributors are voted in by the governors. And each distributor, as I mentioned, is more of a coordinator. That's hence the term, actually. And all of the governors have a vote on all of the distributors. So even the governor of all our costs who down here in the cusp still has a vote on the distributor of the edge, which is way on the opposite end of the Confederacy from them. I mentioned the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister is voted in by the Ministry, but the Ministry isn't voted in by anyone. The Ministry is appointed by the Prime Minister. Now, this may sound like a weird, but it's a very strange, self-repeating balance of power situation. Again, the Prime Minister's only real job is to function as the face to other nations, to external powers. Within the Confederacy, the Prime Minister has no power whatsoever. They can't do anything other than appoint the members of the ministry. That's their only job. Now, so what happened was the first prime minister was selected, okay? Once that prime minister was selected, back when the Confederacy was formed, it was a troll, of course. That prime minister then selected several individuals, a lot of trolls, but some others too, some ogres and some bandelings, and said, you'll be in charge of this, you'll be in charge of this. And there was this big process for deciding who to appoint. And they appointed members of the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Commerce. You get how that works. It's very British, actually. And once all of these people were in place, the system was set so that, per Naverre rules, at any point in time, the ministry can oust the prime minister if they feel they need to and vote in a new one. Sometimes this has been amicable. Sometimes they've said, look, you've done a great job for us, minister, but we believe Bob Joeface over here would do a better job, especially given the current climate. Will you please step down? And the prime minister said, I will step down. You got it. I'll talk about that in a moment. I need to remind myself to talk about that in a moment. Sometimes it has not been amicable. Sometimes the ministry has basically had to oust a prime minister, and there's been internal fighting, and the prime minister, I gave you this job. Why are you moving me from power? You know, that kind of a thing. Keeping in mind, again, the prime minister doesn't actually have real power. They have a lot of luxury. They live in opulence. The central capital of Yarak, which the party's actually been to, is a study in excess. There's literally places that distribute tiny little fragments of gold dust into the air, so it smells like money. This is not a joke. So there's benefits to being the prime minister. Now here's the thing I wanted to remember. Being a prime minister carries almost no power and a lot of responsibility. So it was considered acceptable that whenever the prime minister, obviously the prime minister gets room and board and all the luxuries of living there, their food is taken care of. You know, basically they're living bill free. They don't have to pay anything. So any money they make, it just goes into pocket. That's disposable income. When they are retired, peacefully, if it is agreed by the ministry that retires her, she I keep saying her because so many of the prime ministers have been female, she or he then gets basically a stipend for the rest of their life. It's not large, but it is enough money to live comfortably for the rest of their life. And that's one of the benefits of becoming prime minister. Now, so the prime minister, so any given ministry can choose a new prime minister, and there's obviously some lobbying for this left and right. Lunacha of Seeker herself, the most recent prime minister and the one who was the prime minister when the Confederacy fell, she was a very devious, subtle, quiet manipulator. She was extremely politically adept. She basically wormed her way up there. She actually was a member of the Ministry of Commerce specifically, before she was selected from within to replace the previous prime minister. And she used her position in ways that several other prime ministers have, but basically she made contacts. She wouldn't actually do things against the interest of the Confederacy. That would be political suicide. What she would do was she would go to parties. Now this sounds weird, but try to understand. Try to picture what it would be like if the actual leader of a given nation in the real life here would go to parties held by by corporate heads or whatever, you know. Now, of course, there are social functions that leaders of countries do go to, but I'm talking like a step down from that. She would go out of her way almost all the time to constantly socialize and socially network with basically everyone she could. The economically affluent, the politically affluent. She wouldn't distinguish either. She would meet with the show, she would meet with the Asta, she would meet the Alluvians, she would meet with other members of the Naverre. She was extremely well connected. And while she had very little power to do anything in the Naverre, she was the face for everyone else. So she had the ability to actually present a lot of situations where it would seem favorable to go her way of things. And that meant she could convince people to do things outside of the Naverre, which they would then do because they felt it would be beneficial to them, and she would do that to gain favors from other members outside the Naverre, thus getting more and more people connected to her and in debt to her. She still has a lot of those favors. What happens of that we'll see. At the moment, she's well on her way to basically taking over Guido's company from within. Lord knows she has the influence. I'm not sure what else to talk about. There's one little cultural thing. There's a bit of a thing in the Navarre. You may have noticed that some cities start with the AL dash and then the name of the city. That's actually this whole thing. So if your city name does not have the AL dash, usually, with like, I think, one exception, what that means is your city has not made it yet. Your city has not accomplished being a true member of the Navarre Confederacy yet. Instead, you're still burgeoning. You're still in your childhood, basically. It's kind of the same in so many cultures, in real life as well, but also in Primus, of earning your name. A city has to earn the all, which is how that's pronounced. A city has to earn the name all to go in front of it. And there's no definition for that. There's no, like, petition. There's no, well, fill out this form and checklist. And the only people who can vote on that are the mayors and citizens of other cities in the area. And that's kind of vague as well. So some cities have been named all blank, like all Jalima, all Erat, all Arkas. Some cities have not. Now, I mentioned a couple of exceptions. One of the major exceptions is the city of Yarak. Yarak, it was actually decided when they were founding the Confederacy, even though Yarak in every way qualified as the center of power for this new Confederacy. And it makes sense politically, economically, geographically. It's a major hub in every way, land, sea, and air. However, well, not air at the time, but you get the point. Now it's a major air hub. They actually made the decision to remove the all from the name. It used to be all Iraq. They got rid of the all to emphasize that whether the city has made or not is not relevant. Yarak was giving up its right to be a true city and as a sign of service for the Confederacy as the whole. This was originally part of a plan to basically make Yarak separate from the states. In other words, Yarak would be federal territory and not a member of its own state. Obviously, this was changed, and there was some fighting and some compromising, and there is now the Yarak state instead of that. So that was part of that as well. For those curious, if Yarak did consider to be made it would be changed to Al-Yarak, just like the other ones. I could go on about the cultures of the individual, peoples and whatnot, and several of the cities that people have encountered, but I'm not sure what else to share. So, as ever, I'll just chop it off here. Hope you've enjoyed hearing about the Navarre Confederacy. And I guess I'll see you guys next time.